All right. So, who wants to share what was discussed in your breakout rooms? You had three points of conversation. What was the main obstacle for the author? What's the connection that can be made through all three readings? And then, how can your gifts, talents, and attributes help you to fulfill your purpose? Who wants to share? Go ahead, Odyssey.
My breakout room discussed that the connections that the three passages had were about spirituality.
Mm-hmm. Dope. So, who else wants to share about either the greatest obstacle for the author, or your gifts, attributes, and talents leading to your purpose, or why did I ask that question?
Well, I think one obstacle he had was every time he had to return home, he had to be reinitiated or cleansed by the elders. They knew that he was somewhat getting a poisoned education in the West. And so he wanted to, and then also convincing the Western world that other realities existed outside of their reality. So he always, whenever returning to the West, he had to sort of deal with that battle too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jelani. Does anybody want to touch on question number three? And again, if you don't have an attribute or gift that you could recognize yet, why do you think I asked that question of you? So, Sebastian, what is your, if you guys got to talk about that, what did you guys talk about in your group? Or why do you think I asked that question?
We didn't get to that question. We were still on number one and number two, or we're
Okay.
still talking about number two.
So, why do you think I asked you that question then, Sebastian?
Asking our number three, right?
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, why do you think I asked you question number three?
I'm not sure how to answer that, to be honest with you.
Okay, think about it. Think about it. I'm going to circle back to you. Who wants to help out Sebastian? Why do you think I posed that question? How can your talents, gifts, or attributes help you to fulfill your purpose? Cassandra, what do you think? Why do you think I asked you that question?
This is kind of a shot in the dark, but I think this question is related to um, thinking about our personal self connected to the rest of the world. So the sense of community that these texts talk about, like sometimes in the Western world here in America, we're removed from the sense of community and togetherness, and it's very like individualistic thinking.
Yeah.
So I think this might be relating to that.
Yeah, in a sense, absolutely, right? But we'll do this. I'll get into my notes and I'll kind of articulate a little bit more reasons as to why I posed that. So this passage is pulled from the book of Water and the Spirit, Ritual Magic, and the Initiations in the Life of an African Shaman. The author is Malidoma Patrice Somé. It's kind of hard to see. But he's a brother from Burkina Faso, West Africa. And the way that I was introduced to this text is kind of interesting. I was doing my undergrad at Cal State LA. I was in a Pan African Studies program, and we had in a Pan African Studies class, excuse me. And we had a guest speaker in the class. And the guest speaker so happened to be the current chair of Pan African Studies, Dr. Nana Lawson Bush. And he had us do this project, and he had divided the class up into two groups, red side, blue side, right? And we were assigned the task of coming up with a system that would completely subjugate and oppress the other group. So if you were on the red side, you had to come up with a system that completely oppressed the blue side. If you're on the blue side, you had to come up with a system that completely oppressed the red side, right? So we go through that exercise, and he asks us, what are your thoughts about the exercise? And me and my hubris is like, yo, I think I know what this is, right? You got red and blue, African, European. And really the answer to this issue of colonization and conquer is for African people throughout the diaspora to return back to their Africanity, African names, African spirituality, African dress, right? It's like, okay, that's cool. But I would say to you, You don't know Africa like you think you know Africa. In fact, there's things that go on in Africa that are beyond your realm of understanding. And then he suggested that I read the book. I'm like, all right, bet. Let me read the book, see what we talk about, right? So I get through the book, and he's fucking right. Like, my mind was blown. There was things that took place in the book that just doesn't make sense in our understanding of reality. And one of those things he mentions in passing in the introduction, right? He talks about very briefly his grandfather's burial ceremony, right? But he doesn't go into great detail. But in the book, he goes into vast detail about that ceremony. And I'll paraphrase for you, just to kind of get a sense, to give you a sense of what Dr. Bush was talking about. So his grandfather makes his transition, or what in the West they may call he dies, right? And 3 days go by, and the elders from the community, they come into the space to where the grandfather's body is at. And they come in with these big jars, right? These very big jars. And they start to pour herbs and medicines in the jars, and they begin to mix the jars. And the more they mix and the faster that they mix the jars, smoke begins to be produced within the room, right? And the room gets smoky. And Malidoma says he kind of looks through the smoke and he realizes that the elders have walked away from the bowls, but the bowls continue to stir, on their own, right? So no one's stirring the bowls, but they're stirring themselves on their own. And as he comes to the realization that that's what's going on, the bowls begin to levitate off the ground and they get stuck on the ceiling, right? So this idea or this notion of gravity is defied by this inanimate object that are the bowls, okay? The elders take the contents of the bowls and they pour it around his grandfather's bed, sprinkle some dust around the grandfather's bed, and the grandfather sits up out of his deathbed. This is all Malidoma producing his first-hand account of the ceremony. So after that, some more elders come into the space. They come with drums and they're chanting, right? And the rhythm of the drums and the rhythm of the chanting causes Malidoma's grandfather to not only sit up out of his bed, he stands up and he begins to dance, right? And he dances 2 miles to his burial site. And they place him into the ground, right? So in the Western world, there's no way none of that shit could happen, right? We don't have the understanding, the capacity to think that once someone dies, they could come up, right? In fact, we use death because death symbolizes finality, right? It's done. But if you notice, I said transition, right? And in the African context, there is no concept of death. You transition from your physical space to the spiritual, right? Remember, we're just spiritual beings have a human experience, right? And the Africans are in tune to this, and they say you don't die, you just transition. What others may call reincarnation, right? So he opens the chapter by letting us know what his name is, Malidoma Patrice Somé, which means he who befriends with the strangers or with enemies, right? And then they state that the Dagara believe that every individual comes into this life with a special destiny. And a person's life project is therefore inscribed in the name that he or she carries, right? So Ali say every time that you hear your name, it will remind you of what your destiny and what your purpose is. Jelani, every time you hear your name, you'll be reminded of what your purpose and what your destiny is, right? This is the intentionality behind someone achieving a certain name or being granted a certain name. So in our world, we're far removed from the Dagara, right? And we don't really assign names with that same type of intentionality. But what I substitute for your name is your gifts, your talents, and your attributes, right? God, the Creator, the Most High, Allah, Yahweh, whatever you so choose to call him, her, gifts you these things so you can fulfill your deeper purpose, right? And then he goes on to say his greatest obstacle he encountered when writing this book was there's no words in English for the phenomenon that happens in his culture, right? So there's no word that will describe what I just articulated about his grandfather's burial ceremony. We have no word in English for that, right? So his difficulty became, how do we translate what cannot be spoken that happens in Africa to an English language. It becomes hard. In fact, he says there's an element of violence that takes place when you transfer something from one culture to another, right? And he's attentive to that violence. We know that he was stolen from his home and spent 15 years in a French Jesuit missionary school. And he says there he was he was taught the white man's reality, right? The history, the science, the mathematics, right? But he says all of these topics were presented with a good dose of Christianity and his temperamental God who forced everyone to live in a constant fear of his wrath, right? So there's two things that play here for me. One, Malidoma being an outsider to the Christian faith, he has his own understanding and concept of God that his indigenous culture provides him, right? And that God is not temperamental. It's not a God to be feared, right? But when he's indoctrinated into this Christian version of God, he notices like, yo, this God, he's kind of iffy. Like if you don't get down with what he wants, he's gonna make you sure that you fear him, right? That's vastly different from how I understand and relate to God. He goes on to say, I especially know why my people have such a deep respect for old age, right? And this is another thread that we can find between the readings, right? Just a reverence for old age. And in the Dagara society, you find that the elders and the babies have the highest reverence in that society, because the elders and the babies are the closest to the ancestors. Why are the elders and the babies the closest to the ancestors?
Because they're this closest to the spiritual world. Like the baby hasn't been born yet, and the older person is going to be soon reunited with the spirit.
Absolutely. That's exactly why. And because of that closeness to the spiritual world, the Dagara feel that the elders and the babies have a direct line of communication to the ancestors. So when the elders talk, the whole society listens because they feel that the words of the ancestors are being delivered. When a baby says something, everyone listens because they feel that the ancestors are trying to communicate through this baby, right? He goes on to say, and why a strong, functioning community is essential for the maintenance of an individual's sense of identity, meaning, and purpose. So the community is designed to help you to fulfill and understand what your purpose is. You're not left on your own to kind of figure out what that purpose is. The community is designed to help you fulfill that. It's designed to give you a sense of your identity, right? So there's a tension at play within the text. What do you guys feel the tension is at play within the reading? What's the tension? What's the beef? What's the rift? What does Malidoma's name mean?
Be friends with strangers and enemies.
So Ali say, who is the stranger or who is the enemy in this context?
The Western people.
The Western world, right?
Yes.
So the tension at play is the Western world's culture and the indigenous African culture, right? So these are the two cultures that are in tension. And he's attentive to the fact he's watching his ancestors and his elders observe the Europeans come into Africa. And he's watching how they decimate African culture, how they decimate African life ways, how they decimate the land, right? And the only way that they can rationalize this activity, this behavior, is thinking, well, these Europeans either fucked up their land so much that they have to come here and fuck up ours, or they're out of contact and out of pocket with their ancestors, so this is why they act the way that they do, okay? So Malidoma gets older and he lives his life mission and he finds himself in the United States, he finds himself in the West, and he notices a shift that takes place from the West being concerned with colonizing Africa and African culture to them now wanting to preserve African culture, right? And he says that anytime a culture is being preserved, that culture has now become an endangered species, right? And if you think about the museums in Europe, which are filled with African artifacts, their rationalization will be, well, we're doing this to preserve those artifacts, right? They're not going to tell you how they went in, caused wars, massacred, raped, pillaged, and took those artifacts. They won't tell you that part, but they'll let you know we're preserving, right? So he says once that preservation takes place, you're already an endangered species, which to me is very profound. I was also attentive to the tribal power of his talisman, right? That little pouch that he got that allowed him to see the answers to his test on the teachers' faces, right? So it's this phenomenon of African technology being useful in the Western world. To me, that's really profound. He makes a claim on page 7 that for me, I don't necessarily agree with. I'll read it, and I want you guys to think about that for a little bit. He says, here in the West, I have a great deal of time for spiritual contemplation and study, and much more time to share things of the Spirit with others. If I were still living in my village in Africa, nearly every spare moment would be taken up with scratching a living from the exhausted soil that is all colonialism has left us. Right? So he says, because I live in the West, I have this time, this leisure to contemplate matters of the Spirit, to speak with people about spiritual matters. So we all live in the West. How much time do y'all have for spiritual contemplation? Does anybody spiritually contemplate in this class?
Maybe when I'm in this class or other classes, but besides that, no.
And I would even argue, Cassandra, not even in this class, we may talk about spiritual matters, but you're not able to contemplate, right? You're not able just to let your mind wander and go wherever it takes you. I'm kind of guiding our conversation, right? And we don't have time for that because what? You got work, you got school, you got kids, you got all these things that will distract you. So my contention with this claim is not because, Malidoma, you live in the West that you have time for this. Your occupation, you're an author, and you're a spiritual advisor, right? So by default of your occupation, you have to spiritually contemplate. It's not because you're not in Africa, right? Because all of us in the West, we don't have the leisure to do that. You have to carve out time. And then I would even argue that's not a priority for us in the West. When we do have some free time, we watching TV, we on social media, engaging in sports, whatever the case may be, right? And I also bring this up as an intellectual practice for you all to be attentive to. You don't have to take everything that's written in the book as truth, right? In fact, I would encourage you to read something, disagree with it. Just get in the habit of disagreeing with what you read, and then intellectually work your way to see if you could agree with what the claim is, right? That's just a good critical practice. Okay. I think he lays us a very concise thesis on page 8. He says, what I'm attempting to share with you in this book is only one of the endless versions of reality, right? So that lets you know that there's multiple realities that are taking place from a Dagara standpoint. And on a close read, he kind of tells you that the language that you speak will dictate your reality. There's a certain reality that comes with speaking English, right? There's a certain reality that comes with speaking Swahili. There's a certain reality that comes with speaking Tagalog, right? So there's multiple realities, and he wants to make you aware of one of the many endless realities that are here, right? And he kind of gives you an example of this, because in the Dagara society, there's no word, there's no concept or an idea of the supernatural, right? Because things that we view as supernatural in the West is normative, it's natural for the Dagara society. So they don't have a concept or an idea of the supernatural. He goes further to say, there's a close connection between thought and reality. To imagine something, to closely focus one's thought upon it, has the potential to bring that same thing into being, right? So what you think, if you place enough mental energy on it, will manifest into your reality. So there's a close connection between the imaginative and the real, right? So like in the early 2000s, there was a documentary that was getting like wide circulation, and it was called The Secret. And essentially what the secret was about was just that if you think about something enough, you speak on something, you act on it, it will become your reality, right? And it became like this big new age thing, kind of birthing to the science of mind movement, what have you, right? But I find it interesting that Malidoma is saying, you're like, yo, this is not new thought. This is something that's been going on since the beginning of time. This is how African people actuate their reality by using their imagination, right? Then he gives you the experiment that he does with Star Trek, right? He gets a little TV and a VCR and a generator, and he shows his elders Star Trek. And he says that Star Trek is the West vision of what the future could be, right? And he was like, for my elders, that's what we doing already. Like this cat Spot with the ears, like, bro, that's a cordon bleu. He's just too tall to be a cordon bleu. Like, that's no, you travel through space and time, bro, we do that by meditating and closing our eyes. You're not telling me nothing new, right? And then he says, the irony that the West sees the indigenous world as primitive or archaic. He goes on to say, wouldn't it be wonderful if the West could learn to be as archaic as my elders are, right? So he's taking this notion of societal advancement and flipping it on its head. It's like, yo, what y'all view as y'all future is our present reality. So who's really the more advanced society here, right? On page 9, he makes another claim that I find to be very fecund. He says, it is my belief that the present state of restlessness that traps the modern individual has its roots in a dysfunctional relationship with the ancestors. So the restlessness that you find in people in this Western world is due to the fact that they can't connect and align themselves with their ancestors. And it made me think about indigenous cultures, right? Indigenous people on this continent, they have a very strong connection with their ancestors. The movie Coco, right, is strictly about honoring your ancestors, making sure that Abuela's picture stays up on the altar, right? Malidoma gives us the example of someone to be kinged in an Asian country, and before they take the throne, they have to go to the temple and commune with their ancestors for guidance and advice, right? So that shows you a very strong connection to their ancestors. In my home, we have an ancestral altar. On a monthly basis, we do a ritual to honor and seek guidance and reverence from our ancestors. We leave Igbo, right? I set a plate of food at the ancestral altar just to show the reverence for the ancestors. Those type of practices aren't widely recognized in the West, right? In fact, they may be deemed as demonic, as voodoo, or all other kind of things that they'll peg on those things. But Malidoma says this restlessness that we feel in the West is due to a lack of connection with the ancestors. And I'll close with this on page 13 to close out the final paragraph of the introduction. But before I do so, I want to ask, can somebody define for me or provide an example of alienation? What is alienation? And you can also think about the root of the word alienation. What is the root word, and how can that may be able to help you to understand what alienation is? What's the root word in alienation? There's two words that are put together. The first one is probably the root word. That would be what?
Alien, a foreigner.
Thank you. Thank you, Jelani. Yeah, someone who's different, right? Someone who's isolated, right? So he goes on to say that alienation is one of the many faces of modernity. Now, this word modernity, okay? There's two ways that you can think about and understand this concept. One is the modern, right? We exist in a modern world, okay? That's the surface level understanding of modernity. But at a deeper level, from a historical epic standpoint, right? Modernity could be understood as when the Europeans took over as world powers, right? So when that Greco-Roman Empire came to be known as the world power, that's the beginning of this iteration of modernity, okay? So he says alienation is one of the many faces of modernity. The cure is communication and community, a new sense of togetherness. By opening to each other, we diminish the pressure of being alone and exiled. So for me, this is it. This is what it all boils down to. And this is the thread that we could draw between all three readings. This notion of relations, right? This new sense of togetherness, right? Because the cure, he says, to alienation is communication, meter nefer, good speech, right? And community. The essence of what relation is, how you relate to one another, right? So this is the concern of not only Malidoma, but of Ma'at and of the teachers of B'tah Hotep, right? How do we relate to one another? It just strips it down to the bare minimum basics, okay? So those are my notes for the reading. Let's transition into our fishbowl. Remember, you could either pull from your journal, you could talk about what was discussed in your breakout rooms, or you could pull anything from my notes that I just provided you all. Is there any volunteers for the fishbowl? Okay, Alice, thank you. And then if you've gone twice, let me know so I can know not to call on you anymore.
Thank you.
Yes, Emily, thank you.
Can I go as well?
Yeah, Monica,
Yeah.
thank you. Do you want to get one more? Are we good? Yasmin, are you raising your hand or are you clapping? It looks like a clap. I'm not sure. Okay, Yasmin, I got you. Perfect. So we'll have Alice, Emily, and Yasmin for our fishbowl. I'll be quiet, and whoever wants to set it off is on you.
I'll go first. I'm gonna be saying some things that I wrote on my journal. For my thesis, I put being from two worlds can affect your mindset and spirituality. And my analysis is Melodoma was a part of two worlds, the birthplace and the West. Being separated from its birthplace and being taken somewhere completely different can be damaging to the mind and soul.
I agree with her. Since for my thesis that I put that I believe the thesis was mainly about spirituality and there being endless versions of reality and imagination.
Thank you, Monica.
I feel like the passage, like the water spirit, I feel like it brings like power healing, well, power and healing to the community of both the modern world and then the tribe world. And then I feel like this like relates to other readings we read because I feel like the author was trying to like share his desires and teaching of knowledge to the people, and that was what was like in the first passage where the author also shared like his wisdom and like truth to like the people too.
That's a good point, Emily. Thank you. Yasmin, it's on you.
There was something that you spoke about how society is like when he spoke about like society is like corrupted, and it relates to today's society because it's also somewhat corrupted. There's like injustice in colors, and that's basically what.
Okay. Thank you, Yasmin. So thank you all who's fishbowled. I think for me, one thing that's definitely central is the two worlds, right? Like he's definitely articulating the reality of the two worlds. But one thing I haven't heard, and again, like so, this is my sixth time going through this lecture. This is the first time that I heard healing, and I think that's fundamentally important. And even for me, reading this is something that I don't place enough attention and emphasis on because although he's offering critiques of the Western world, right? Although he's critical of the Western world and he juxtaposes the Western world versus his home, his task is to heal both, right? Is to befriend the enemy, right? And I think this notion of healing becomes fundamental. And I think also when you talk about spirituality, you talk about education, and you talk about how the ancients, how the Comedics understood those two intersections, right? Spirituality and education. They were one and the same, right? And I believe if we approach education from that standpoint, education could be a space for healing if done correctly, right? So what I like to do is open this up to course conversation with the time that we have left. I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts about the readings, anything you agree with, anything you disagree with. You just open up to any type of conversation that you guys seek to have. What did you guys think about the talisman, the little pouch that he got that helped him essentially get into college, get through college, and he didn't have to go to class at all. He just, I don't want to say cheated. He used intuition to get his way through college.
It kind of reminds me of like crystals and stones that a lot of people use today, like rose quartz, carnelian, like moldavite, all of those type of crystals and stones.
You know, Jelena, it's actually not too separate. They all are really birthed from the same science. So you're really on track. Ali, say?
Yeah, I was gonna say like the talisman was really cool to learn about because it says that in the passage that he read the answers through the auras of the teachers. So I'm like, okay, that's really cool that he can read the auras of the teachers.
Yeah, I don't know what my aura is giving off, but hey, it's giving off something, man. He has the intuition to read it. Christian?
I wanted to ask a question. It's
Yeah.
like I didn't understand how he said that the talisman it was considered both like good and dangerous, and I don't know why it was dangerous because like all the examples he put up, it looked like a good luck charm to me.
Yeah, that's a great question, Christian. So one thing, if you read the story, the actual book, it kind of goes into how a lot of that, what I'll call technology, right, is used and manipulated for evil. And there will be individuals in the text who would use their talisman to do harm to people, right? And that's why he says it can be dangerous. And it's not more so the talisman itself, but it's the intention behind it, right? So based on what your intention is with this technology will determine whether it's beneficial or harmful. And it's no different from technology now, right? Social media could be a great advocator to bring us all together, or it could cause you great harm and cause people to commit suicide if not done with the correct intention. So to me, it translates the same. Yasmin?
He was like, he said that he was kind of like scared to take it out the airport because he didn't know like what they do to his bag. But there was a cop that was African American that he said it was voodoo.
Yeah, I found that interesting too. 'Cause I'm like, it would be a black motherfucker that say some shit like that, right? Like, and he had fear of it, right? But at the same time, I found it interesting that he knew what it was, right? So he may have, his grandmother may have had one. May have had a great uncle. So he had some kind of connection to that because of his Western training. He's been constructed to fear that, right? That's a good point. But also, right, not all technologies can go together. Because Malidoma didn't want his talisman to go through that x-ray because he didn't want that x-ray to damage his talisman. Good call out. What did y'all think about his need to go get a spiritual bath every once in a while when he spent too much time in the West?
I say that if it's really good for you to recharge, like for example, like that for me is like my meditation. Like I'd be meditating every day. It helps me recharge. So being somewhere that you're not familiar with completely, you're out of your comfort zone, you need to recharge. So I think it's really important.
Yeah. There's an article that myself and the chair of the Department of Pan-African Studies co-published, and it's titled "Get Out: Schooling as Spirit Possession." Right. So the thesis of the article is that your K through 20 schooling experience is a conduit for spirit possession. Right. So it's designed to imbue into you the spirit of the European, right? So if we are to take that as truth, then an exorcism needs to be done, right? And at times that bath that Malidoma has to go through can serve as that exorcism, right? In the article, we argue that decolonial pedagogy is that spiritual exorcism that has to take place within the system of schooling, right? So these baths become vastly important, right? Anybody familiar with smudging? Jen Lin, you may be familiar with the practice of smudging. But that's a bath, a spiritual bath that you could give to your space, right? Clear out the energy in your space. And so part of smudging is to burn sage in a space, right? And what the sage does, it cleans out the spiritual energy in the space. But then you're supposed to trace that sage with some type of incense, right? So that way your spiritual energy can be infused into that space. So again, it serves the same purpose as that bath served for Malidoma in his body and his spirit. You could do that for the environment that you occupy, right?
Didn't Malidoma also say that one of the guards was holding his talisman thing? And isn't that bad for other people to be touching and
Absolutely.
giving their energy to your stuff?
Absolutely. And he also says that's why they make it to look ugly, to smell bad, to kind of prevent people from wanting to handle it, right? So yes, it's a very good call out. I mean, how to phrase this. You have to be very careful with engaging in matters of spirit that you don't understand. You have to be very careful in engaging with matters of spirit that you don't understand, because it could be harmful for you. That's where that danger could come in that Malidoma is talking about, right? And I think it's a shame that, especially as marginalized groups, right, we have been separated from that spiritual technology. Because shit, think about how easy school would have been if y'all had a talisman, right? I mean, that's just like a fundamental basic example. But think about all the other things that could be generative for you if you had that spiritual technology. Let me ask you guys this. One way to understand the talisman is this concept of funds of knowledge, right? So funds of knowledge is information or knowledge that gets passed down from generation to generation. That's cultural, that's family oriented, right? Who can provide me a funds of knowledge that you received? What is your family's talisman that you have been passed on that helps you navigate this world that you occupy? Can anyone think of an example? And it doesn't have to be an object. It could be a saying. So for example, for me, I was always told growing up, to be black in America, you have to be twice as good just to get your foot in the door, right? Average won't get it. You have to be excellent just to get your way in. So that's the funds of knowledge that was passed down for me that helps me navigate this world, right? So it doesn't have to be an object. It could be a saying, a mantra, whatever the case may be. Nobody?
Yeah, I'll say one. My mom, she's like a very fun person and she's really positive. So whenever I was anxious about something, about presentation or something, and she would tell me like, keep your head up because it makes you seem confident. And then once you feel confident, you'll start feeling confident.
Yep, absolutely. It's a great example. Okay, so I would like to do this, and this will lead to us to close out our conversation today, and also provide you guys with your homework assignment for the week. So the tension at play is the two worlds, right? The Western world and the indigenous world. W.E.B. Du Bois calls that tension double consciousness, right? So for black folks, as W.E.B. Du Bois articulates in The Souls of Black Folks, the first chapter of our spiritual strivings, he says there's two ideals, there's two thought process warring inside of one body, right? So it's the idea that you have as a black man, right, or a black woman, and then it's the idea of how the Western world views you as a black man or a black woman, and those two ideals are warring, right? Malidoma is speaking to the same tension within the two worlds. One of the survival mechanisms that develops out of those who possess or occupy or live with double consciousness is this idea of code switching. Who has never heard of code switching? So we all know what code switching is then. Okay. So how to understand in a esoteric way what code switching is? It's about priorities and it's about valuing of culture, right? So if you're bilingual and in your home you speak Spanish, right? But when you go outside of your home and you go to school, you go to the grocery store, you go to restaurants, you code switch to English, right? And you don't use Spanish in these spaces. Implicitly, what you're saying is this English language has more of a priority, more validity than Spanish, right? Black folks, y'all bilingual too. It may not be a totally different language. We call it Ebonics. We call it African American vernacular, right? It's a separate language. And every time that we code switch to sound more professional and to sound more articulate and to sound more aware, you're devaluing how you normally speak on the block, right? So what that says is my authentic self, what I will call my divine self, because this is how you are when you come out the womb, right? That's your divine self. This is not good enough for this world, so let me be professional, so I can acquiesce to what this world says I should do, right? It's code switching. Again, it's a survival mechanism, so I understand it as that. So keep that in mind, right? But your task is to not code switch. If you normally speak only English in this space, speak some Spanish to see what happens. Speak some Ebonics, see what happens, right? If you have an ethnic sounding name like Manzili and you always change it to David because it sounds more European and acceptable, don't do that shit, see what happens, right? Now I say that with this asterisk, don't get fired, don't get your ass whooped, be smart about the way that you go about pushing these boundaries, but push them. Right? Go ahead, Cassandra.
Could code switching also be what we wear? Because I know Melodoma mentions, I think it's on the last part about wearing his robes in America, and then he'll wear his costume, which is like a suit and tie, and then he'll speak English in front of a group of people. Yeah, so is it also how people visually see us, how they think of us?
Absolutely. Low key, I started to wear my dashiki today just for that reason, but it's just too hot for that shit. And I was like, I'm not about to be up here sweating in a dashiki to prove a point. But you're right. That is a form of code switching. Gender norms can also be perceived as code switching, right? So, the machismo home, the home where the father is the authoritative figure, right? Try to lean up against them norms and see what happens, right? Again, don't be disrespectful, don't do nothing to get your ass whooped, but push back and see, right? Because again, it's really about being comfortable being your authentic self wherever you go. Me, I don't code switch. I don't do that shit. How I talk to y'all is how I talk on the street. It's how I talk when I'm a student in my Ph.D. class, right? These are two things that I find when I do this. Is one or two phenomenon takes place. Either someone gets super uncomfortable, and that, for me, lets me know who you really are, because something about my true self makes you feel uncomfortable. But that's your problem, not mine, right? Two, especially when I have black professors, right? And I've been fortunate enough at Claremont to have about, 4 black professors, which I didn't think was going to happen. But anyway, they start off the semester and they sound very educational and they sound very professional and yada, 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 right? But I start talking, and about 3 weeks in the semester, all that button-up shit starts to relax. Their voices start to get a little bit deeper and not as nasally, right? And they start to use little, characteristics and speech patterns that are more likened to the block, right? So what happened is my comfort made them feel more comfortable, right? And you'll be surprised how when you are your full self, which you'll get away with. You're right. Just looking at the chat, Jen Lynn is saying that it sucks because it isn't acceptable in today's society. So here's the kick. Here's the crux. It's not acceptable because we keep code switching. We keep code switching because we don't want to make the other feel uncomfortable. So what we do is we make ourselves feel small so they can feel big. And I'm saying, fuck that. Be yourself. Make them adjust. And that's your task for the week. Now, your real homework, right? It goes back to question 3. Spend some time in spiritual contemplation. Think about your gifts. Think about your talents. Think about your attributes. Think about what those gifts and talents are and what they're pushing you to. Because what they're pushing you to is your life's purpose, is your destiny. But the only way that you'll know that is by spending the time and thinking about what that is. That's why we meditated today, to give you a conduit to tap into that true self so you can know and understand and actuate your purpose. That's why I tell y'all I'm not concerned with your grades. That's not my job. You'll get them, right? Because I understand that's a criteria of this Western world. But my purpose, my duty, my destiny is to get before you in the form of your professor and to get you to realize that, A, you have a purpose and it's not your occupation. It's not to make money. It's so much bigger than that, right? Again, if we are spiritual beings having a human experience, my job is to tap into your Ka and have you realize that the Ka is your real self and that Ka has a mission, right? So if I'm doing my purpose correctly, I'm helping you to fulfill your purpose. So spend some time in spiritual contemplation thinking about these talents and these gifts. And then if you are able to pinpoint what that purpose is, your job then becomes to fulfill that purpose with all that you have in you. And do not cease in fulfilling that purpose. Think back to the teaching of Ptah-hotep. Follow your heart. And when wealth comes, follow your heart some more. To do so is to live your purpose. And I promise you, watch how the pathways get cleared for you. Watch how people will carry your name into rooms that you have never set foot in. Watch how the ancestors will secure your travels because they know you're doing what they placed you here to do. The world will be at your fingertips because you're in tune with the universe. So that's your task for this semester, and I would say for the rest of your life. The money will come, but more importantly, that peace of mind will be there. When you wake up to fulfill your purpose, you'll wake up early because you'll be excited to do that. Because you'll know that's why you're here. And that's what's real. Before we close out, I would like some thoughts on your guys' homework assignments for the semester and for this week. Monica, what do you think about your homework assignment? Monica Ibanez, what do you think about your homework assignment? Nicole, what do you think about your homework assignment? Nicole Rodriguez.
Hello?
Yeah.
I think it's a very like helpful way of like, I mean, I'm not saying anything, but I just feel like the way that you put it out there is less like stressful than like other professors and stuff like that. And I like how after each reading and stuff, we have like a little like I like how you like the thesis and everything like that. It's kind of helpful to like basically put it in your own words about the whole passage of what we're reading.
Okay, real quick, Nicole. What I'm talking about is the homework that I just assigned you to not code switch or to find out what your destiny and purpose is. That's the homework I'm referring to. So what do you think about that in particular? Go ahead, Cassandra, you can speak on that.
It allows us to practice what the reading is trying to communicate.
Yeah, it's this idea of praxis, right? It's taking the theory and putting it into action, right? And more importantly, it's a practice that allows you just to be your true self all the time. Real quick, let me just show you guys what the reading is for next week, and we'll call it a day. All right, so we're still in the section weeks 4 through 7. We just completed Of Water and the Spirit. So for next week, we'll be reading Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind. So Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind is just one PDF. I will, email that out to you guys either tomorrow or Friday. But if you want to get started now, that's available to you on the Google Classroom site. Any other last minute comments, questions?